Hello everyone, this is Will at Windblown, also known as William of Orange on Instagram. Things haven't been too bad for me during COVID-19. While I can't print, I can paint and I can engrave, but despite being fortunate enough to be able to work, I'm kinda getting lonely. My favorite thing about art school was being able to talk to people about what they are doing and what I'm doing. Unfortunately, I can't do that now. I figured this might be a good way to talk and share what I'm doing, maybe even see if anyone's listening. I've been painting for about 6 years seriously, so if you're looking to be dazzled by the techniques of a master painter, I'd recommend watch someone else, like Andrew Tischler or Al Playfa. While I enjoy watching these artists paint, I have to admit I struggle to be able to understand what they are doing. My problem is that they're so talented and so experienced that there is a certain degree of magic about their painting. I found things are only magical when they are beyond the limits of my comprehension. I'm trying to make something that's a bit more accessible. So anyways, think of this as a work journal from someone who's trying to improve but still has a long way to go. Take everything I say with a grain of salt. I don't think I've ever made two paintings with the same combination of techniques. If you are going to take anything away from this, I hope it's that you should feel comfortable not having everything already figured out. Before the beginning of this video, I made a detailed preparatory drawing. The last painting I made, I did the same, but I went straight into painting. This process is very direct and works for a lot of artists, but as I was working on my last painting, I ran into two issues. The painting felt a bit over-modeled at times and a bit fragmented. Over-modeling and fragmentation are two sides of the same coin. Starting with over-modeling, value or lightness and darkness is perceived in relation to its surroundings. Over-modeling occurs when something appears to have much more contrast than its surroundings because of its surroundings. Over-modeling commonly occurs with textural details in light and reflected light in shadows. In other words, over-modeling describes the over-exaggeration of these slight contrasts. If not consciously avoided, this over-exaggeration can compromise the illusion of volume in your painting. If people are interested, I can go into further explanation in another video, but I would prefer to keep things simple here. For the sake of this explanation, think of a value scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the darkness. Everything in light is below 5 and everything in shadow is above 5. The basic rule to avoid over-modeling is no textural shadow in light should be darker than 5 and no reflected light in shadow should be lighter than 5. The second point I want to talk about was fragmentation. I've generally observed that I have a tendency to find and paint the exceptions in a color and emphasize all these slight variations in the color over the average. While an eye for these slight variations can make some beautiful work, it's also very easy to lose sight of what the original color was. I've been trying to avoid that. A long time ago I did a portrait and I painted all these fragmented total variations into the shirt. I worked on it for such a long time and was so focused on these slight little fragments of colors that I eventually lost sight of what the general color of the shirt was. It was only after I took a day off and looked at the shirt again when I realized that the shirt was yellow and not white. For my new painting, I'm hoping to unify things a bit by starting with an underpainting of raw umber. For anyone looking to sound fancy, the name of this type of underpainting is Grisaille. My goal for this underpainting is to give me a general idea of the value structure to avoid over-modeling and also maintain some unity tone through the painting to help combat my tendency to fragment color. There's a lot of things in art that I feel like should have names, but they don't really have names, and I feel like one of those is just the different types of grisaille, because there's not really just one type of grisaille, there's a lot of different types of grisaille. The type of grisaille I'm doing here, I like to call it a wipeout grisaille. And basically the process of doing this is I coat the entirety of the canvas with an even tone. Generally, the way I was taught to do this, you want to be pretty dark on the value scale, something like a 6 or a 7. Just looking at what I'm doing here, it seems like I'm going for a 3 or a 4. So it's going to be a pretty light one here. I think I did this because I wanted to be able to see my drawing still pretty easily because it was relatively light. And then after you do that, you basically just wipe out the lightest areas of your composition. You can see here I'm starting to wipe out what is a little bird feeder in this composition. You can see I'm trying to kind of do my wipeouts without a brush. I'm just using a paper towel. Something I kind of like to do is move away from using brushes, just kind of try to get more creative with the types of marks I can. So when I have the opportunity to use something like my fingers or a paper towel, I try to use it. I just find that this kind of creates a more organic feeling throughout the entire painting than something as like systematic as applying everything with a brush. You'll also notice I am wearing safety gloves because there's a lot of turpentine, or this stuff is Gamsol that I'm using right now in this process, and I would prefer not to get that on the hands. The bottle of the Gamsol says it's minimally toxic, but I found that it kind of dries out your hands a lot and will leave you with a bit of a burning sensation. So I try to avoid that because I'm just not sure how healthy it is. Now I'm kind of working on the beginnings of what a little flower pot in beginning would be. And this looks like a tree that I'm doing right now. And again, I'm just trying to kind of get a general idea of where the lights in this composition are. Now I'm starting to do the outline of the patio. And the way I kind of have conceptualized the light in this piece is that the light is coming from the left side of it. Sorry about this cut here. I have a camera that can only record 20 minutes at a time, so I'm still getting the hang out of using it. So I'm trying to kind of create the illusion of a cascade of light throughout the painting. Here I'm just wiping out the general values on the bottom of the patio. You can't really see it in the video here, but I laid down a pretty tight grid of kind of the perspective of what all the little tiles are. So I'm working really carefully, really light, not to smudge those pencil marks underneath this underpainting. Now I'm moving back kind of to the roof of the house. And for the rest of this composition, I'm just trying to wipe out what are the lightest values and what's basically where my whites are going to be in this composition. I first learned this type of underpainting when I was studying under Daniel De Silva at the Long Island Academy of Fine Arts. He was a really great instructor. Back in that time, I was a high schooler, kind of in my rebellious high schooler phases. And Dan was just kind of willing to listen to me, kind of be my edgy teenager self, and he was okay with that kind of thing. So I really learned a lot from him, not just this style of underpainting. I think the most valuable thing I learned from Dan was his limited palette that he used, which he basically adapted from a CMYK color scheme, which is a really interesting thing to adapt into paint in a limited palette. You can see I've just about reached the point now where I've done wiping out all the major kind of things that I want to be light in the composition. So what I'm doing is I'm starting to go in with a brush. The general rule when you're doing underpaintings that I was taught and was kind of drilled into me when I was studying painting was that you want them to be as soft as possible. In painting, it's a lot easier to lay down a sharp edge than it is a soft edge. So here, I'm just trying to keep things as soft as possible. Of course, I have a pretty good understanding of the correct way to do that, but in the application of things, I have a bad habit of doing the opposite of what the correct thing is. So I'm kind of going to be sharpening and softening things as I go around the painting. You can see here I'm starting to sharpen the shadow, which occurs when you lighten another area with a brush, which is kind of an interesting thing when you paint this type of thing. It's not quite like a watercolor painting when you're diluting it like water. When you're kind of painting on turpentine, it will lighten one part, but then it doesn't the brush won't pick up the pigment. It will actually kind of push it away from kind of the border of where that turpentine is, which will cause you to sharpen an edge in an underpainting. When I was studying I used to do this a lot, and when I was studying under Manu Saluja at the Long Island Academy of Art, she kind of really drilled into me to avoid doing this, because you want as much unity as possible in your underpainting. Again, though, I'm sharpening things up, because old habits die hard, and I wanted it to look pretty. But, yeah, I'm just going through again, reinforcing things. Now I'm starting to kind of key in my dark values, and you can, unfortunately, see me trying to explain to my mom when she came in that I am videotaping. So I'm getting started with those dark values. So basically I've keyed in my lights. Now I'm basically putting in what's going to be my dark. And thank goodness I remembered to actually soften things. So I'm now softening up that shape. You can see here the first time I put in that dark shape on the right side of the wheel, I was basically just dry brushing it in. Then this time I wetted the brush a little bit, so that paint is kind of it's not a scumble right now, it's kind of getting pushed around. To clarify the language I'm using here also, a scumble is kind of where you're working with dry pigment and you kind of are pushing it across the canvas. It might not really seem different from the normal application of paint, but when the kind of the sensation brush handling is very different from what. For anyone wondering also, the type of brushes I'm using are wolf hair brushes. These were some brushes I picked up actually when I was in China. They are a bit soft, they're softer than bristle, but they're also something that's a bit more coarse than sable, which I find I like a lot. I really, for these types of things, I prefer to use softer brushes. Something like a sable, though, I find is a bit too soft, and it kind of makes your grisailles look very kind of perfect and flat. Well, I don't think probably flat's the best word, but it's like a very, very even texture. And I find if the baselines of your, like the underpaintings and the lower levels of your painting kind of have those perfect glass finishes, you're not going to kind of organically develop those textures throughout the course of the layers of the painting that are going to kind of make things feel more organic. Something you'll notice also as I'm painting this grisaille, you can't really get straight into that darkest value the first time you put it on. You need to kind of let the paint dry a little bit, and because you're working with paint that's thinned out by Gamsol or turpentine, things dry really, really quickly. So I'm kind of reinforcing the darker values after things have dried a little bit by just painting over them with some more dry paint. I've always found it interesting how people complain about oil paint drying too slowly, but my general observation is that it dries way too quickly for me. There's a lot of techniques where you kind of have to work into wet paint, and I've always been at the end of the day like trying to work in an area that I started at the beginning and find that that layer is dry. And when you kind of are painting into tacky paint, depending on the medium you're using, there can be a tendency for that lower kind of layer that's kind of half gelatinized of paint to kind of unbind, and you kind of basically have like the paint peeling itself off the canvas, which is why you can either work with a painting that's like completely dry or work into something that's completely wet. But yeah, you can't really work into tacky paint. Given the choice also, I generally find it's easier to work in a wet paint than dry paint. So here I'm just kind of working in the general shapes. Something that when you're starting to learn painting that they always will tell you is work from general to specific. So I'm trying to keep my shapes as big as possible. I probably should be using for something like this a larger brush, but I'm really just kind of thinking about shape. I'm not thinking about the perfect brush handling and stuff like that. So I find if I'm just using one brush for everything, that just makes it a little bit easier on my end to think about value. Another thing to consider if you are doing a grisaille yourself is, I've been told, and I have some experience with it also, if you add a little touch of linseed oil or some type of medium to your paint, you have a lot more control over the middle values. So right now it's kind of, for my painting, it's light and dark, and then I'm kind of trying to scumble in those middle values like what I'm doing right here. But you can actually build up some really, really nice transitions and get some really good control over those middle values if you use linseed oil or something like liquid for this type of part. The reason I'm not doing it is not really that I have anything against the process. In fact, that's the way I prefer to do it. It's just I ran out of linseed oil a long time ago during quarantine, so I am currently without linseed oil. What I'm trying to do here is get a little bit fancy also. This is kind of an old wooden trailer that I'm painting here. And you'll see I'm kind of trying to get a little bit fancy with the texture of it, because it has this like beautiful wood grain in the actual composition. So yeah, I would not recommend trying to do something like that in a grisaille, just because you're going to be painting so many layers on top of this that it's not really worth going for those individual little details. Which again, you just, on these types of things, want to articulate the value, articulate the general shapes, and just make it as soft as possible. And that's why, for instance, here in that little area I just painted, I wasn't trying to paint the tree bark. I was just trying to kind of get the general transition of light across it. One of the things I found when I'm painting that I generally think is kind of the most important thing when I paint, and what I think separates myself from most artists, is I'm really, really concerned about how things look in binary, in blacks and whites. And I try to kind of have a singular black-white shape kind of scheme going throughout the entire painting. I realize that this isn't necessarily appropriate for every painting. In fact, the last painting I did didn't really have much of that. But at least kind of abstractly when I'm doing all these things, I'm not really thinking about the forms or even the shapes. I'm thinking about kind of that black and white binary throughout the entire painting. If this is a type of style of composition you're interested in, I download a handy app on my phone. It's called the Notenizer. Basically, it allows you to take a photograph and you can kind of play with the value scales, and it will really restrict things into that black-white binary. It's not a perfect tool for getting a composition together, but it kind of helps me, at least sometimes when I'm just sitting on a train or like in a car and I'm thinking about kind of a painting that I want to make, and it gives me something to fool around with. I've always found it kind of funny. I'm making art in a kind of a Western art making tradition, but my primary influences are usually from Asia, specifically China and Japan. I'm really captivated by traditional Chinese ink paintings. I don't know if anybody's ever tried one of those, but they make it look so effortless, and there's this really just kind of beautiful chirographic art making traditions. But what I learned when I tried doing it myself is it's really, really difficult to get those kind of controlled values with the ink. So you're kind of stuck working with that binary of black, and you have to kind of figure out how to kind of maneuver the brush in a certain way to try to get it to be as expressive as possible. So I'm really captivated by Japanese woodblock prints. This is partially because of my background in printmaking, but it's also because of how expressive the format of woodblock printing forces the printmakers and the carvers to be, because you can only get 1 or 2 colors per woodblock print. And because of the production deadlines and how they were kind of made for mass consumption, the artists really had to be smart about kind of the time and the resources and the teams of people they were working with. So they had to try to make each block as expressive as possible. So I'm moving into one of the trickier parts of the composition, which is this boat. So in the composition, there's this really pretty effect where there is these trees in the background, and there's kind of light that's filtering through the trees. And as the light that's filtering through the trees is catching this boat, it's creating a very subtle kind of silhouette and highlighting effect. Kind of like when you see those like fashion photos and the model always has that like kind of shimmer of light on her hair. So I'm trying to kind of get that effect, but it's really hard to do that without darkening the boat itself. So I think I got a little bit carried away here, making that boat dark. So in a future layer of this painting, I'm going to have to go back in and lighten it up a little bit. And the reason I would need to do that is as things are farther away from you, they are they are lighter than they are when they're up close. That's because as things are farther away, there's less contrast, and so they're kind of more neutral in value. And it's due to it's a effect painters call atmospheric distortion, which is basically kind of the atmosphere kind of stands in between you and the subject and makes things more neutralized and grayer. Yeah, you can see here I'm going in with a paper towel to really try to lighten things up. But one of the trickier things about a grisaille is making kind of an edit like this, because especially as I'm working it more, I'm basically right at this point just softening everything, hoping maybe to spread that pigment around and lighten things up. But if you add turpentine or Gamsol or whatever solvent of your choice, it's going to kind of push the pigment to it's going to push the pigment around, and it's going to kind of create harder lines, and it's actually going to create more contrast. So it's really hard to take away contrast from a grisaille. Here, what I'm trying to do, it seems like I kind of gave up on trying to lighten up that boat, so I'm trying to optically make it read as lighter by making the things around it darker, which is a good trick, but it can also lead you astray sometimes by putting contrast where it shouldn't be. Yeah, there I go. You can see the effect that happens when you put the
kind of a brush that's loaded with the turpentine on that area is it really kind of will lighten up that area and kind of force that hard contour into the dark, which is really not what I want. So I'm just working around it, giving that time to dry, and I'm going to go back in once it's a little bit more dry and try to soften that transition out just so it's a little bit less jarring, which it kind of worked. I still think I'm going to need to go back into it and a layer above it to just lighten that area generally up. Now I'm working around it a little bit and still softening it some more because that's far away in space, so I want to make that as soft as possible. Here you can see I'm starting to work on what is going to become a little wood pile. And this wood pile is kind of part of my interest in the subject matter. Basically, at the beginning of the summer, this property was totally covered in leaves and twigs and stuff like that, and me and my uncle have been raking them up. And we kind of let this pile sit here for much longer than we should have, and a brown recluse spider, which is one of the few spiders that are kind of dangerous in this area, decided to take residence in here. And when we were trying to move it into the little trailer that's parked next to it, a spider actually bit my uncle, which is a pretty scary thing because they cause your skin to kind of fall apart and they cause nerve damage and stuff like that. So you really don't want to get bit by one of those. So I think that maybe just kind of my morbid fascination with those types of spiders and stuff like that might be part of the interest of this composition to me. It's kind of interesting rewatching this footage because while the boat was kind of a disaster, it looks like I'm doing a pretty good job kind of sticking to what is the classically trained way of doing things, which is to keep things nice and soft. So I'm going to have a very easy time painting over that and not going to have to kind of paint over work that I've already done. Now I'm getting started kind of trying to lay out the general idea of what these trees are going to look like. So something that's very important to me is a term that I call gesture of the tree, which is what I'm doing here right now, which is to try to get those general angles of the pattern of leaves, which I find accounts for a lot of the character of what the branches look like. The term gesture is something I kind of adopted from figure painting and kind of my background in that sort of stuff, because there's always like a general set pose, which you call the gesture of the pose, which is basically, for me, it was always a couple lines, which generally outline like where the great trochanter or the bottom of the rib cage and just the general bone structure of the model is. And I kind of at least think about trees that way, like I would a figure painting or a portrait. It's not really a term I like to use too much anymore, though. I had a critique back in college where I was talking about the gesture of trees, and everybody was really confused because to most people, gesture implies movement, where to me it kind of implied bone structure. So it kind of caused a lot of people to be very confused because the trees looked kind of stagnant. They weren't gesturally moving. So I don't really use the term too much anymore.
The section that I'm moving into right now, it's kind of in the composition, or it's not really in the photograph, but it's in the composition when I was kind of sitting in the morning eating breakfast, kind of seeing the scene play out, is there's a lot of light that's filtering through this tree, and it has that kind of very Hudson River School feel to it, where it's like a tree that's being backlit and there's that cascade of light from it. So one thing that I'm trying to kind of convey is what light is going to look like kind of passing through it. It's not really something I can do with a underpainting, but I feel like one of the many reasons why I was drawn to this scene was just how pretty it was to see the light kind of casting through that tree and kind of casting onto the different forms of the subject, which is really one of my favorite effects in landscape painting, and something that I am constantly trying to do, but I never seem to really be able to pull it off the way I would like. And I realize that probably if I am really interested in trying to do something like that, the best way to do it would be to actually do a copy of a Hudson River School painting or one of those things. But I don't know, I just generally like to come up with my own way of doing things. And I'm content with the fact that I haven't gotten it yet, but it's one of those things that maybe down the line eventually, if I'm still interested in doing it, I'll eventually figure it out. What I'm doing here is I'm going to be going back over kind of the brushworks that I've already made And I'm going to be trying to basically flatten out the underpainting, flatten out the shadows. It's one of those things I picked up from doing a lot of figure paintings. It's kind of interesting when you flatten out your shadows and you take away information from the shadows and you add it to the light of a painting, it will actually kind of make the light areas stand out more. So it's kind of one of those techniques that arise from the Flemish school of painting, where they would basically have absolutely nothing in their shadows besides like the raw underpainting, and then they would really just kind of build out layers and layers and layers in the lights, which give it like a really beautiful sense of volume. So I'm trying to kind of keep those shadows as flat as possible, but it's a little tricky to keep something to feel like a tree and also have flat shadows. So it's something that I'm always trying to do, but it's not quite something I can get yet. I think it's kind of about finding a compromise and just practicing to be able to kind of have those nice flat shadows so that you can build light on top of them. I've developed kind of this funny saying. I've never heard another painter tell it, but something I always tell myself is that if my underpaintings aren't perfect, that means the painting above it's going to look even better, because I'm not going to be too afraid to mess up what I already have. So with that kind of, I guess, general idea and working theory, I kind of like to just kind of leave the paintings and the underpaintings in a more unfinished state and not work in them too much. So that's about as far as I'm going to take that back section of the painting, and I'm now just kind of going to roughly articulate in the railings that are kind of leading into this. I have like a little step, like a grouping of steps that's going to lead into the composition. And again, I'm just trying to roughly articulate the values, because I find if I put too much time into these underpaintings, I become attached to them and I don't want to paint over them. So it's going to be really rough, really dirty, but that's kind of the job I wanted to do, is to just give me a nice kind of tonal basis to get started with the actual painting on top of it. So I'm just about finishing up here. I'm adding kind of the rough details into the painting, and unfortunately I'm not going to get kind of to the conclusion of me working on this underpainting because my camera died as I was filming this, and I'm very new to this whole YouTube video thing, so I didn't realize I needed to periodically check my camera battery. So we're probably going to lose about 10 minutes of the footage, but you can just imagine I kind of painted in what's left, and you'll see it in the next video. Something I'm wondering though is, how do people feel about kind of the playback speed of this video? Currently I have the video sped up to 400%, which is 4 times as fast as it is in real life. And the reason I picked this number is that if someone is curious to see like how fast I'm actually moving when I'm making this painting on YouTube, you can kind of go to the settings of the video, you press the little kind of thing that looks like a gear, and you can make it go to 0.25%, which will bring it down to the speed that I'm actually moving in real life. So I'm wondering, do people think that's kind of a valuable tool for them to be able to see? If it's not, when I was first trying to learn how to do painting and just kind of get a sense of what painting was, I watched a lot of speed paintings on YouTube. And one of the things that I kind of didn't understand from watching them is you really lose a sense of just how fast someone's actually moving when you see them moving at these like really, really fast sped up paces. So I found that when I was trying to do my painting myself, yes, I understood that this was I was watching footage of paintings where people are sped up, but I didn't realize how fast they were actually going. So is this helpful to be able to slow it down to the exact speed I'm moving at, or would you prefer it faster? Let me know. And also, thank you very much for watching. This is the first time that I've ever done this, so thank you for bearing with me.